Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Federal employees navigating their TSP investments in 2025 are facing more than just market volatility. They're caught between the emotional pull of FOMO and FOGI. Fear of missing out urges quick action, while fear of getting in warns of looming crashes. But smart investors learn to tune out the noise, focus on long-term strategy, and let process, not panic, guide their decisions. Here to break down the risks and offer a practical path forward in his latest analysis is wealth advisor with RMG Advisors, Tiago Glieger. Tiago, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Terry. Good to be here.
You're going to teach us a new acronym today. We know FOMO, fear of missing out, but what is FOGI?
FOGI is a new way of looking at this, where we have the fear of getting in. And it's interesting because most people have heard of FOMO, but this FOGI is this new idea that there's both sides of the coin that we really need to be looking at, right? We've got when the markets are doing really well, people are scared of getting into the markets. And then the idea that we don't want to miss out is very natural to us, but we also want to protect what we have. And so that's where the fear of getting into the markets becomes very relevant to us.
The market has been kind of scary lately, so you kind of can't blame people. But how should folks, especially who've been parked in the G fund forever, think about maybe making some changes?
I think as federal employees are looking to, is this the right time? There's obviously a lot of concerns looming around things like the tariffs and the economy. There's inflation that just seems to be so persistent. And we also have people not spending as much. We have a lot of these red flags popping up in the economy. And so we start to get these questions about, is it really the right time to be putting my money out of the G fund and back into stocks after everything that has happened? The markets have recovered. So you start to get this fear of getting back in again. And, at first this sounds like you're being very reasonable, but the idea is it's almost a tug of war, right? We want to protect our money as we're getting in and make sure that we're not getting in at the top, right? We often hear these ideas of, I'm just waiting for a better time to reinvest the money, right? Or, gosh, I know there's a 15% drop here somewhere, so I'm just going to wait for that until I get back in again. Let's just see how things play out over the next year. Right. And it's really tough, too, because of how volatile the markets have been over the last couple of years. Everything that has happened in federal service, federal employees are feeling like they often may not have total control over their circumstance. And so we try to cling on to the things that we do have control, like, hey, how am I going to be invested? Right. And so the problem in that is that the markets don't wait for anyone. Right. And if you miss out on getting in and the market keeps going up, did you miss out on a lot of growth that maybe you really needed for your retirement? And that's the big challenge.
Well, the hot tip is always buy low, sell high. But figuring out when low and high are pretty tricky. So when people think about timing the market, what's your advice there?
I think we really need to be careful of the fantasy that we can get that timing correct, right? We might get lucky every once in a while, okay, where something really is very obviously smacking us in the face, and then we get out or we get in at the right time. But the idea that you can continuously do that correctly over and over again, this is not something that happens over time. And so particularly this last run around, the markets were, every red flag was going up, right, with everything going on in the economy. And even the people that knew and were in the know thought that the markets were going to keep falling. And they didn't. They reversed, and we're right back to the beginning of the year again in terms of where the markets are. And so we have to be really careful about how we feel and not let our investment decisions be guided by feelings, but rather some sort of process that we have, right? If you look at the principles of building a financial plan, one of those is, how do you construct a portfolio that helps support what you're trying to do? And so thinking about your money in terms of, hey, when are my timelines, right? What if I'm wrong about this right now? Is that going to impact my ability to retire in 5 years or in 10 years because I've just been sitting on the sidelines the whole time? So we have to ask these really hard questions.
I'm speaking with Tiago Glieger. He's a wealth advisor with RMG Advisors. Tiago, I think your advice is sort of like starting a fitness program, right? It's discipline, it's decision, decide early that you're going to do it. What are some of the rule-based frameworks that can help people get over this feeling of being stuck or their fear of getting in?
Yeah, I think what we can do that's really helpful to a lot of people is to just look at some of the facts. When we look at what the S&P 500 has done over the last 20, 30, 40 years, the S&P 500 in the TSP equivalent, that is the C fund, right? We have about a 30% chance or so of being negative in any 12-month running timeline. So that's pretty high. 1 in 3 chances you might actually lose money here. But as we start to push out from 1 year to roughly 5 years, now we're looking at only a 20% chance of a 5-year rolling period being in the negative. And as we look to 10 years, that number further drops to about 10%. And you can see here, the further out we go, the less chance of you're actually losing money in the S&P 500 or the C fund. And so this brings a lot of good clarity to an investor that truly what's most important is, when do I need the money, right? This is what we call in the business, we call it time horizon. And that can be the biggest deciding factor. So when someone is going to retire, let's say over the next 5 years or so, the rule is, hey, look, if you're looking at 5 years, hey, that's about a 20% chance that your money might be down by the time you need it. So you have to be a little bit more careful. You might not want to go 100% stocks when you have that little time left. But as you're looking into retirement, you might be retired as long as your career was. And so 15, 20, 30 years from now, you're going to need some money then too, and inflation is going to have done its erosion on your money. And so, but by then, what's the chance that the S&P is going to be lower 20 years than today, right? And that helps us guide clients and then helps investors get comfortable with being in the market because they know they have that time.
So rule number 1 is think about your time horizon. What about the dollar cost averaging rule?
Dollar cost averaging is a really powerful tool, Terry. I'm glad you brought that up. The idea is that you are deploying money over time, and you're riding the wave either up or down in the markets. And it sounds a little counterintuitive because you would want to buy when things are cheaper, not when they're high. But if you do the math, getting in periodically over time, even if you bought a little bit of the market as it was at an all-time high again, over time, that average actually works out better for you because you're picking up more shares of stocks, more parts of the equities markets, and that compounding interest over time actually allows you to build a lot more wealth than you would if you were just timed yourself perfectly in the moment. And this is what the TSP contributions are, right? Every time we get paid every couple of weeks, we have some of that money get squirreled away and put into the TSP. And that consistent deposit is what we call dollar cost averaging.
So the third rule might be diversification.
Yes, and this is one of the things that the TSP has really struggled with over the years in only having a few sectors in the markets with its core funds. And so finally they released the TSP mutual fund window, which has about 4,000 options for federal employees to diversify. It's the old, don't put all your eggs in a single basket adage, right? We want to make sure that there's different parts of the markets that are spreading out the risk. Simply because when one thing is doing better, there is often a different kind of investment that maybe is doing poorly, and so the better one offsets the poor one. And then we also have this idea that there's investments that are not correlated to each other. And especially for retirees, we want to reduce volatility because that kind of volatility in the short term in retirement, that's a big risk to you. So the diversification is a big part.
The decision framework that you're laying out for us is really like my workout plan, which I pick my workout the night before, I lay out my workout clothes, I set my alarm, and then hopefully I get up and go do it.
That's right. Because then when you don't feel like doing it, right, everything's already set for you. You've got your framework. It just makes it that much easier.
But it takes the emotion out too, and that's where people get stuck. Tiago, thank you so much for this wise advice today.
Thanks, Terry.
I've been speaking with Tiago Glieger. He's a wealth advisor with RMG Advisors. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
What makes a great leader in government? Christine Harada joins WEPA CEO Shane Canfield to reflect on her journey from aerospace engineering to the White House. In this episode, she shares lessons on public-private collaboration, leading with purpose, and why service, not power, should guide leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Christine Harada, former Senior Advisor at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget. Ms. Harada, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You spent portions of your career working in both the public and the private sector. And from your experience, what makes leadership in the federal sector different than the private sector?
At the highest level, leadership in the public sector is very fundamentally at its core mission-driven. Right? The work is in the service of the public good, and the goals and the programs are frequently long-term, they're systemic, and they're incredibly complex. And success, isn't necessarily measured by quarterly earnings. We don't have that kind of drumbeat, but certainly more by the lasting impact that we have on Americans' lives. What's also unique about public sector is, in my view, the profound sense of history that you feel. And I think certainly I was very aware about the work that I was doing and how it builds on the efforts of those who came before me, and that future generations of leaders also depend on the decisions that were being made today. And that, for me, certainly provided a greater weight of responsibility.
That's a wonderful answer. And I was in the private sector for much of my career, and now WEPA is a nonprofit, and I really relate to what you said about being mission-driven rather than profit-driven. You've got a long-term view, and always at the core of it is serving others.
Yes.
Is there a moment that stands out to you from early in your career that influenced your leadership style later on?
I started out my career as an aerospace engineer, building satellites and airplanes. And when I first entered the workforce, my organization at the time had 120 people. We were a large company, 120 people, 4 women, and I was the only woman of color. I was also the youngest throughout the entire organization. And so, I remember having an experience when I was doing some engineering work. We had a design review, and I had seen some issues with the flight software that I pointed out. At the time, they're like, maybe it's not really that big of a concern. I was like, but in my heart, I knew that the issue was real and stayed with it. And sure enough, a few weeks later, that topic came up again and we addressed it. Turns out my concern did indeed prove to be valid. And so it's just one of those experiences that really sank into me around ensuring that I am listening to everybody, period, end of story, within the organization, really thinking through about how do we take into consideration opinions from all different spectra. As a third-generation Japanese American, right, I was raised to be humble, keep your head down and work hard, et cetera. But at times, leadership also requires you to speak up, do so politely, with courage, et cetera, even though you may be the only voice in your room, but certainly trust your voice. It also really helped shape my belief around diversity. DEI programs right now are viewed in a negative light. We're all mosaics, and they become better because you have those different experiences, and that's really stayed with me throughout the entirety of my career.
The diversity issue is a really big one. Coming from the insurance industry, that's an industry which is working on that. It's really a diversity of viewpoint and perspective and experiences that does influence your business, and more diverse employee bases absolutely helps. Was there a time in your federal career, perhaps when you were at OMB, that you faced what you consider a real challenge, and how did you overcome it?
One moment that really stands out in particular was when I was serving as the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer during the Obama administration. We had set, like many administrations, had set some really ambitious goals, very, very, very ambitious goals around how do we think about making the federal government's operations much more sustainable. But the challenge wasn't so much about the scale or the technical capacity of the organization. A lot of it was really centered around the funding. We overcame this largely by being very strategic, helping out with blocking and tackling with the variety of legal issues or legal questions that might have come up, like how do we address this? Certainly in the federal government, you're more often leading through influence as opposed to pure form authority, and that you really need to listen deeply, communicate clearly with folks, building out those coalitions and, engaging with your stakeholders. And I know many folks in government speak like that, but that is the truth.
As someone who's spent time in both the federal and the private sectors, what makes the relationship between the two sectors important?
Certainly, it's an absolutely essential partnership, and I would add on to that, like nonprofits or philanthropic organizations. As I mentioned before, I'm Japanese American, and in Japan there's a symbol for thunder, which looks like 3 arrows pointing, around each other in a circular pattern, kind of to represent the swirl, if you will, of clouds. And that's kind of how I view the relationship between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. The government frequently sets the vision, the policy, the direction, but of course it's the private sector that brings the capital, the innovation, the skill set, the capabilities, et cetera, to be able to execute. Partnering with that, of course, are the nonprofits who may be supporting the surrounding society. Public-private collaboration is not just about contracts or compliance, but it's also about figuring out what's your shared purpose. That's when real transformation can and does actually happen.
In life insurance, there's a concept, lifetime value, where bringing a new insured in costs a lot more money than the amount of premium. And so when you talk to commercial carriers, it's a similar kind of thing. You need to bring them into the concept that they're going to be with us 20 years, and after 5 years, you can ride through that. But it's a concept that isn't easy for commercial businesses to understand. That's a partnership too. Very, very similar. What advice would you give to somebody aspiring to become a leader in government?
There are 3 things, right? So firstly, around leadership in government, you want to make sure that you're leading with purpose. You want to stay grounded in your values, and don't underestimate the power of relationships. Remember why you entered public service in the first place, and that'll help carry you through some of the inevitable challenges that you're going to face. Making sure that you are also investing in relationships. In government, you rarely have full control, and I think this is, in my view, more important in government than perhaps in the private sector. You are frequently leading through influence. You are collaborating with very different parties who frequently have very different agendas than you do. And so building that trust, investing in building that trust and planting those seeds earlier and along the way in your career, I think is absolutely critical. And certainly last but not least, I would say, don't feel that you have to have it all figured out on day one. Absolutely stay open to the unexpected, say yes to the opportunities that stretch you, and know that you can lead from wherever you are. It's not just about position or hierarchy, it's about the impact that you can have.
What wonderful advice, especially in today's world, which is a little topsy-turvy. Who is one person, someone you know personally, or perhaps someone well-known, that's impacted your leadership style?
The leaders that particularly stand out for me are Colin Powell, a woman named Carla Harris, who was a managing director in investment banking, and then last but not least would be my father. Starting with perhaps the more famous one, Colin Powell. I read his biography, loved his perspectives and the rules of leadership that have been particularly influential for me, right? So get mad, then get over it, share the credit, perpetual optimism, a force multiplier, things of that nature. And hearing his story was certainly very inspirational for me. And so I certainly very much look up to him and as a role model. The second person that I mentioned is a woman named Carla Harris. She's an African-American woman, became a managing director at an investment bank in the 80s, at a time when there were not that many women of color in investment banking in New York. And so she's published a book called Her Pearls of Wisdom. It's one of her trademarks. She always wore a pearl necklace, and she has pearls of wisdom around how can you be authentic and build relationships to be successful in super challenging environments. And she had a lot of guidance on the importance of finding sponsors and mentors. And certainly last but not least, my father is really my why for I do a lot of the work that I do in the public sector. He started out life like many other, immigrant kids in poverty. He was a strawberry farm laborer. Japanese Americans at the time were not allowed to own the land, so we worked the land. He grew up in that kind of environment. And I just think it's absolutely neat that someone who came really he was dirt poor, to say it, and his daughter ended up working in the White House twice. It's quite the American dream, and I would very much like to have that opportunity available for other people as well.
Well, wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Christine, thank you very much for your time today and all of these learnings. It's really good, impactful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.